The first thing she felt was the shock of cold. One moment Arenya Thorne was standing on the bridge with her wrists tied and the Alpha's men holding her like a problem to be solved. The next, she was underwater, and the river punched every bit of air from her lungs. She kicked, but the rope around her wrists dragged at her balance, and her dress turned heavy. She tasted silt and iron and panic. Moonlight blurred above her like a silver sheet she couldn't reach. Her chest burned. She fought anyway. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She tried to twist her shoulders, tried to bring her bound hands under her knees the way you do when you're desperate, but the current spun her, and something struck her hip hard enough to make her see white. The river pulled. It wanted to keep her. A shape cut through the water toward her, long and fast. Arms caught her under the ribs, and turned her the right way up. For a second she thought it was one of the pack come to finish the job, and she thrashed, but the grip was steady and patient, the kind you only get from someone who's done this too many times. They rocketed toward the surface. Air hit her face like fire. She coughed up river water and gagged and coughed again. The man held her behind the shoulders and kept her chin above the chop. "Breathe," he said, voice even, close to her ear. "You're all right." She didn't believe him, but she breathed anyway. Because not breathing wasn't an option. He kicked for the stone shelf under the broken mill and lifted her onto it as easily as if she weighed nothing. Her arms shook when they took her weight. The rope burned at her wrists. She rolled to her side and vomited water and bile. A hand touched her shoulder. Light, checking, nothing greedy, and then left her alone to get through it. When she could see straight, she looked at him. He was pale in the moonlight, not sickly, more like someone carved out of night and frost. Black hair shoved back with wet fingers. A thin scar pulled at the corner of his mouth, as if he'd once laughed through something that should have silenced him. His eyes were a storm color, gray, with a little steel in it. He didn't blink much. He didn't need to. He tore the rope off her wrists with one twist and a pull. His hands were bare. The knot gave like old bread. "Can you sit?" he asked. "I'm sitting," she said, because her pride had survived what the river couldn't finish. He gave the smallest nod, like good, then moved to the corner of the ruined mill, and coaxed a damp pile of kindling into a stubborn, crackling flame. He did it fast. Precise. No wasted motion. Wind pushed at the gaps in the timbers, and the wheel outside turned slow and useless in the current, paddles dripping. She held her hands out to the fire, and watched steam curl up from her sleeves. The heat made her shake harder. He shrugged off his cloak, wrung it once, and set it around her shoulders. It smelled like rain and smoke, and something colder underneath, that had nothing to do with weather. She knew what he was. She wasn't stupid. Wolves learn early to tell predator from shadow. "You're not with them," she said. "No. You knew I was a wolf. I knew you were drowning." He said it like that was enough. Maybe for him it was. She listened. Above the rush of the river she could hear boots on the bridge. Iron, leather, the careless laugh of somebody who wanted the story good and simple. The cursed Omega fell. The river took her. The pack moved on cleaner and lighter. She could smell them too. Wet wool, horse, sour ale. The Alpha's second was up there. He chewed fennel seeds to hide his breath from the women he visited. He wasn't hiding anything tonight. "They'll come down to look for proof," she said. "Or to make it." "They can try," the man said quietly. The way he said it made the little hairs rise on her arms under the cloak. He watched the mill door without staring. There was no swagger in him, no need to perform. It had been a long time since she'd seen a man like that. Among wolves, strength was loud. On him it was just there. "I'm Arenya Thorne," she said, because there's power in names, and also because she'd rather claim herself than have him guess. "Arenya," he repeated like he was testing how the sound sat in his mouth. Cassian Crowe. She knew that name. Everyone did, but quietly. The rogue on the North Road. The vampire the covens couldn't bind and the villages couldn't bribe. Too dangerous for loyalty. Too principled for court. A man with a price on his head, and a line he refused to cross. She had thought men like that were made up to help children sleep. Why me? The words came out sharper than she meant. "You don't owe wolves anything." "I don't," he agreed. "And I don't let the river decide who lives when I can help it." "That's not an answer." His mouth tilted. Not a smile. More like the thought of one. "It's the only one I have that's honest." Footsteps thudded from the path below the bridge. 6 men. Maybe 7. They spread out along the bank with torches. Light ran across the water in broken stripes. A voice called down to them. The Alpha's second. See her? Nothing yet, someone answered. Keep looking. She'll catch at the mill or the bend. Cassian shifted, and for a heartbeat she saw what he truly was. The stillness deepened. The air around him seemed to thin. She couldn't hear his breath. His eyes darkened, and the small firelight found a glint at his teeth. He didn't hide it. He also didn't move toward the door. He looked at Arenya instead. Can you stand? If I need to. You need to. She pushed to her feet. The world tilted once. He caught her elbow and steadied her, then let go when she had herself again. He didn't linger. He didn't play the hero. He just checked she wouldn't fall and moved on. It made her chest ache in a way drowning hadn't. There's a service tunnel, he said. Old millers used it when the wheel jammed. It comes out below the reeds. If you stay low, they won't see us. If one of them does, I'll deal with it. You'll deal with 7 wolves. I'll deal with what comes through the door. It was a simple plan. Simple plans kept people alive. He pulled aside a warped plank and revealed a narrow passage, half mud, half stone. Cold water ran shin-deep along it. She didn't hesitate. She stepped in. He went first, not because he needed to but because he was making sure. The passage forced them close. His shoulder brushed hers occasionally in the dark. His body was colder than the water. The rumor about vampires ran through her head, that they were dead things pretending to be alive. He didn't feel dead. He felt like something that had chosen its temperature and wouldn't be moved. She kept her breathing quiet. The men on the bank argued. One wanted to come down. One didn't want to ruin his boots. Someone laughed and threw a stone into the reeds. It landed 2 arm lengths to their right. Cassian didn't flinch. He put a finger against his lips, and Arenya nodded. When they reached the grate at the far end, he crouched and lifted it with one hand. The metal squealed. A torch swung toward the sound. Arenya held still hard enough to make her teeth holler, then slid into the reeds where he pointed. The mud was cold and smelled like crushed mint and rot. The reeds were higher than a man's head and thick. They hid, shoulder to shoulder, while torchlight smeared along the water and then passed. The men on the bank argued some more, bored already. The Alpha's second told them to give it up. The river took her, he said. Let it keep her. We've wasted enough time. What if the body washes up? Another asked. Then she'll be cold and quiet and the curse will be done, the second said. Move. Their boots thudded off the planks and up the path. Torches faded. The night closed again, full and deep and breathing. Arenya let out the air she'd been saving. Cassian shifted beside her. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't need to. She stood on her own. Thank you, she said. The words were simple and felt right. You're welcome. He looked toward the dark line of trees. We shouldn't stay here. They'll send someone back to be sure. Do you have anywhere safe? She thought of the cottage, the small hearth, the leaf cut into the bread crust for the widow who came for tonics, the way the pack watched her door like it was a stain. Not anymore, she said. Then I'll get you out of their reach, he said. And then? And then? You decide what you want. I'm not your keeper. The honesty in that knocked her off balance more than the river had. Why do I feel like I know you? She asked, before she could stop herself. That doesn't make sense. His attention flicked back to her. Something unreadable moved behind his eyes, quick and gone. The world is full of things that don't make sense until they do, he said. Come on. They moved through the reeds until the ground rose and the mud became leaf mold underfoot. The forest stood quiet and silver. Cassian kept an easy pace that didn't make her prove anything. When branches snagged her skirt, he slipped them free without comment. When she stumbled on a root, he braced her and let go again. It should have irritated her. It didn't. It felt like respect. After a while, her shaking stopped. Her fingers stung less. Her breath found a steady rhythm. They called me cursed, she said into the dark. They always have, since I was a child. I was born during an eclipse. The old seer marked my throat with ash, and said a king would die for me. They decided it meant I was dangerous to the Alpha line. Every mistake the pack made after that was my fault by convenience. Sick calves. Arenya breathed on them wrong. Alpha's son fell from a horse. Arenya looked at him too long. I kept my head down and did the work nobody wanted. It wasn't enough. It never is, Cassian said. No judgment, just knowledge. What did you do that made them choose the river? I sang, she said quietly. The night of the last full moon. The Alpha was drunk. He wanted a show. He wanted me to hum that old lullaby my mother used to hum when the lambs were late. He thought it'd be funny. He laughed when I started. Then he went quiet and he swayed. So did the others. Like the song reached into them and pulled a string they didn't know they had. I stopped when I saw his face. He called me a witch. They tied my hands in the morning. He didn't say poor thing. He didn't say how cruel. He walked beside her like a man who had seen his own version of it. Your mother? Gone. Years ago. Your father? Never knew him. I'm sorry. I learned to bake good bread, she said, because you either talk about the hole, or you talk around it. If you score a leaf on the crust and brush it with milk, it shines like worry never touched it. People liked that. They will again, he said. The trees thinned. A hill rose ahead, topped with the bones of an old chapel. The roof was gone. Stone ribs reached for the sky. Ivy ate half the walls, and the doorway stood crooked. Cassian stopped at the edge of the clearing and listened. He listened like the night carried words only he could hear. Satisfied, he gestured. Inside, he said. It's not pretty, but it's quiet, and no one comes here. There's a place below the altar that stays dry. You hide in a chapel?
I hide where hunters aren't,
he said. And where old promises live. You believe in those more than I believe in new ones. The chapel smelled like coal dust and old wax that would never burn again. Stars looked down through the missing roof. The altar stone had cracked some winter, and weeds grew from the seam. Below it, as promised, a lower chamber held dry floor and a pallet. There wasn't much. It felt safer than anywhere had felt in months. He lit another small fire with a practiced hand and set a dented kettle close to it. You need warmth, he said. And something hot to drink. I've got bitterleaf. It tastes like it sounds, but it keeps your blood moving. I'll take it. He poured when it steamed and handed her the cup. His fingers brushed hers. A spark ran straight up her arm and into her throat. She swallowed and pretended it was the tea. He didn't react, but his jaw went hard for a second, and he looked away too quickly for a man who didn't feel anything. She sipped. It was awful. It helped. They'll look for me at dawn, she said. They'll look for me everywhere they think I might go. They'll make it a point of honor. Then we won't be where they expect, he said. I'll take you past the stone quarries to the old border road. There's a market town 2 days east that doesn't ask questions if you pay in coin and keep your head down. From there you can go north to the coast or south into the hills. I can get you that far. Why? It wasn't an accusation this time. It was a real question. He considered his answer. Because once, he said slow, someone pulled me out when I thought I was done. They didn't owe me anything. They did it anyway. I've been paying that debt forward for a long time. She held his gaze. That's not all. He didn't look away. No, he said. It isn't. Silence wrapped the room. Not empty. Just full of things neither of them knew how to say. She set the cup down. Her hands had stopped shaking. I can keep moving, she said. I won't slow you. You won't, he said. But we're not moving tonight. Your body needs the rest. Wolves heal fast, but not from everything. Sleep. I'll watch. You don't sleep? Not like you do. Because you don't need to? Because dreams aren't kind to me, he said, and that was all. She lay down on the pallet with the cloak pulled around her. The fire popped softly. Cassian sat with his back to one of the broken pillars and watched the door. She felt his attention like a guardrail. It should have been unnerving. It wasn't. It was the first honest safety she'd felt in years. She didn't mean to speak again, but the words came without asking. I think I've seen you before, she said softly. Not like in the village or on the road. Somewhere else. Somewhere older. It sounds foolish. It doesn't, he said. It sounds familiar. What do you mean? He tilted his head. The fire cut a line of light across his cheekbone. When I saw you go over the bridge, he said. I knew what you would look like coming up through the water. I knew the way your hands would fight the rope, and the way your mouth would open for air, and the sound you'd make when it hit. I shouldn't have known any of that. And you dove anyway. Yes, for a wolf. For you. The words landed between them and stayed. Her pulse climbed and settled. She should have asked for proof. She didn't need any. Sleep, he said again, gentler. I'll be here when you wake. She closed her eyes, telling herself she'd only rest them for a moment. The pallet smelled like old wood and thyme. Footsteps sounded in her memory. Boots on a bridge, men on a bank. The sound stretched and thinned and became something else. Oars in a different river, a different night. She dreamed of that, of lanterns swinging, and a city that wasn't this one, and a woman with her hands tied in front instead of behind, and a man with black hair who cut the rope and smiled like the trouble was worth it. In the dream he kissed her knuckles to steady her. When she woke in the chapel hours later, the stars had shifted, and cold had crept into her toes. Cassian hadn't moved from his post by the pillar. He noticed her eyes before she could speak. "Dawn soon," he said. "We leave before the birds start." "All right." She sat up, the cloak slid to her lap. "Cassian." He looked at her. In his eyes was that same quiet decision he'd had in the river. She didn't know why it made her throat tight. "Thank you," she said again. "For now." "For now," he agreed. He stood, fast and fluid, and offered his hand. Not because she couldn't rise without it, but because sometimes it's good to be helped up. She took it. The spark jumped again. He felt it too. This time, he didn't pretend otherwise. For a second they were two people holding something neither of them understood, and both of them trusted more than they should. Then he let go. "We move," he said, all business again. "Stay close. If we're separated, head east until you find the old stone road, and follow the chisel marks. I'll find you." "How?" "I will," he said simply. She believed him. They climbed from the chapel into the thin grey before morning. The forest waited in a hush like a held breath. Far off, a wolf called. The sound raised the hair at the back of Arenya's neck. It didn't sound like home. It sounded like a warning. "They'll track me," she said. "They'll try," he said, and the edge in his voice made the warning in the call feel smaller. They set off together, fast and silent. The night thinned, the trees opened, and the first thread of light pulled across the horizon like a blade being drawn. Arenya glanced at Cassian. He met her look, steady, certain, a man who had already made the hard choice, and would keep making it as long as it took. She didn't know why he'd risked himself for her, not really. She only knew this. He had, and some part of her she thought the river had stolen, lit up like a held breath finally released. She faced the dawn with him. Whatever waited east, wolves, oaths, old curses, would have to deal with both of them. The forest was quiet except for the faint slap of dew dripping from the leaves. A low mist clung to the ground, curling around their boots as they walked. Arenya kept her cloak tight around her shoulders. Cassian led the way, steady and silent, his movement so sure it was as if the woods themselves made room for him. She had never met anyone who moved like that, without sound, without hurry, without fear. Every wolf she'd known made noise on purpose. Growls, laughter, the crash of boots meant to remind everyone of their strength. Cassian didn't need to prove anything. He just was. "Do you always walk in silence?" she asked finally. His tone was calm, amused. "Noise draws attention. Maybe that's the point. Sometimes being loud keeps the monsters away." He gave her a sidelong glance, his eyes catching the morning light like polished steel. "Monsters don't mind noise, Arenya. They mind courage." She didn't know if he meant her pack or himself, but she didn't ask. The path curved, narrowing between the trees. Sunlight pushed through the canopy in thin blades. The warmth felt good on her face. "How far until we reach the border road?" she asked. "Half a day if we keep pace." She nodded, adjusting her cloak. Her wrists were raw from the rope burns, and every step sent a dull ache up her arms. She tried to hide it, but Cassian noticed anyway. He stopped without a word, tore a strip from his own shirt, and reached for her hands. She hesitated. "I don't bite without permission," he said dryly, the ghost of a grin flickering across his mouth. It startled a small laugh out of her. Is that supposed to make me trust you? It's supposed to make you stop bleeding. His fingers were cool but careful. He wrapped the cloth around each wrist, knotting it just tight enough to hold. The moment stretched between them, her hands in his, the forest quiet except for the breath they shared. She met his eyes, expecting to see the cold detachment of a predator. Instead, she saw something like recognition. "Thank you," she murmured. Cassian only nodded and turned back to the trail. "Keep close." They walked until the path widened into a clearing. A fallen log crossed a shallow stream, and beyond it, the land dipped toward the valley where smoke from distant villages curled into the sky. Arenya stopped, catching her breath. She could smell wet earth, and the faint trace of time. It reminded her of home, the good parts, the ones she tried not to remember. Cassian noticed her gaze lingering on the horizon. "You miss them," he said. She swallowed hard. "No. I miss the idea of what they should have been." He nodded, understanding something unspoken. "Tell me," he said. "What?" "Tell me about the pack that thought drowning you would solve their problems." Arenya didn't answer right away. She leaned on the log, watching the water slip past. Her reflection looked thinner than she remembered, her eyes too sharp. "You really want to know? I wouldn't ask if I didn't." She let out a breath. "All right." The sound of the stream came back. Arenya blinked and realized she'd been staring into the current for too long. Cassian stood across from her, his expression unreadable. "They feared what they didn't understand," he said softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I really am cursed." He shook his head. "No, you're dangerous to people who need control to feel strong. That isn't a curse. It's a threat they invented." She met his gaze. "You sound like you've seen that before." "I have," he said simply, and turned away. "Let's keep moving." They walked until the sun dipped low again, shadows stretching long and thin. Arenya could feel the weight of her story still hanging between them. She wanted to ask about his, but didn't know how. Cassian didn't seem like a man who liked questions. Still, she tried. "You talk like someone who's lost his place." He raised an eyebrow. "And what would you know about that?" "I lost mine yesterday." That drew a real smile from him. Small, brief, but real. "Fair enough." They found a place to rest beneath an old willow. Its branches hung low, leaves whispering against the grass. Cassian started a fire while Arenya gathered her courage. "If I tell you something," she said, "will you tell me something in return?" "That depends." "On what?" "On whether I like what you tell me." She smiled. "You might." He gave a slow nod. "All right, your turn first." She sat across from him, watching the firelight flicker over his face. "When I was a child, my mother told me that fate wasn't a line, it was a circle, that if you ran far enough from who you were, you'd meet yourself coming back the other way." He tilted his head. "And do you believe that?" "Tonight I do." "Why tonight?" "Because I don't think it's the first time I've been pulled from a river." Cassian's eyes darkened. The fire cracked. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Maybe it isn't." The willow sighed like it remembered things people forgot. Cassian fed a little more wood to the fire, and sat with the habit of a man who expected movement at any second. Arenya watched his hands. They were steady, capable, careful. Nothing about him was careless. "Your turn," she said. He didn't answer at first. He listened, really listened, to the night. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I was never meant to be a rogue." "What were you meant to be?" "A sword someone else could point." He settled back, eyes on the flames, and the world around them thinned to make room for his memory. Before the exile he wore a black coat with a silver collar and a crest at the throat. 3 crows over a broken sun. The coven liked its symbols, the crows for vigilance, the shattered sun for victory over things that burned. Cassian had been a knight in everything but name, raised in stone halls where the rules were carved into the pillars, and mercy wasn't one of them. He learned to take commands the way he took breath. Loyal, precise, cold when needed. There was a village on the border that missed its blood tithe. Sometimes famine did that. Sometimes fear. The magistrate sent Cassian and 2 others to make an example. His orders were clear: collect the debt, or burn the proof. They arrived just after dawn, when vampires were weakest. Cassian stood in shade, while his partners dragged the village elder into the square. A crowd gathered. Thin men, tired women, children with their chins up because they'd learned early how pride kept you whole. Cassian read the thin ledger. The tithe wasn't missed because of rebellion. It was missed because a plague had stripped the houses, and the living had bled themselves to keep the dying warm, and there was nothing left to give that wasn't bone. The magistrate's writ didn't care. Law was easy from a chair. Cassian looked at the elder's hands, raw from work, not war. He made a choice that didn't belong to him. He told his partners to stand down. He gave the village 2 months, and he left the writ on the elder's table with a stone on top so the wind wouldn't carry it away. "We don't burn hunger," he said. His partners did not agree. They fought him, willing to trade blood for the comfort of following a line of ink. Cassian took the hits meant for the village and left them breathing, because he had already decided the kind of man he would be if command didn't own him anymore. 3 nights later, the magistrate called him traitor. The sentence was swift: exile, hunted by the very crows he'd once worn on his collar. He walked out of the hall bareheaded, stripped of rank and shelter and the right to call anywhere home. You find out who you are when you can't lean on a banner. He survived because he understood how to disappear, and because one person chose kindness anyway. On his 2nd week running, with a wound in his side and patrols closing in, he limped into a barn to die as cleanly as he could. A woman found him there in the straw. Human. No reason to help him, except that she was the type who named strays, and believed even sharp things could learn to be gentle if given a hand. She sewed him up with shaking fingers. When he tried to warn her what he was, she said, "You're hurt. I've got thread. That's enough for the hour." She made him tea that tasted like burnt leaves and patience. She told him to keep still. He listened. When men came looking, she stood in the door and said she hadn't seen anything, and they believed her, because casual cruelty underestimates the brave. Cassian left at dusk because staying would endanger her. He didn't ask her name, he didn't kiss her hand, he didn't promise to come back, he just lived. And living became a debt he paid forward, saving who he could when he could, pulling people out of fires someone else started, walking into trouble so others could walk out. Arenya watched the story move across his face. "Is that where the scar came from?" she asked softly, nodding toward the thin mark at his mouth. "Before that," he said, "I was very good at obeying. The scar is what happens when you make a rule that says, no, to the wrong person." "Your magistrate." "My mentor," he said. "He taught me how to fight. He also taught me that people are easier to manage if they never believe you'll leave. And you left." "I had to," he said simply, like explaining fire. He fell quiet. The willow leaves rustled. Somewhere distant, an owl called once, and then again. The fire painted thin gold on his knuckles. "You don't feed on people," she said, not as a question. "Not if there's any other choice." His gaze flicked to hers. "I'm not ashamed of what I am, Arenya. I won't pretend to be human to make anyone comfortable. But I don't take what isn't offered freely." A small breath. "Hunters and monsters both like simple stories. I don't fit neatly into either." "You saved me," she said. "That fits neatly enough." He looked away as if the ground near his boots had a secret worth studying. "I saw you go into the river," he said, voice thinner now, stretched over something old. "And my body moved before my head did. The last time I felt that was—" He let the sentence drift. He didn't offer the ending. Not yet. Arenya shifted closer to the fire, rubbing her hands together to chase off the chill that had nothing to do with air. "What did the woman in the barn smell like?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "Time," he said after a second. "And flour." Arenya's throat tightened. She'd left a loaf on her hearth yesterday morning, with a leaf scored on the crust. The world has a way of repeating itself until you pay attention. Cassian noticed her expression change and went still. "What?" "Nothing," she said, too fast. He didn't push, which was somehow worse than if he had. They ate in companionable quiet, dried meat, and a heel of bread from Cassian's pack, that tasted better than it had any right to. He handed her the better portion without making a show of it. When a branch caught her hair, he freed it carefully with a gentleness that felt like a question. "You do this often?" she asked. "The saving, often enough," he said. "It doesn't fix the world. It helps one person breathe another day. That's usually enough for night's work. And if it's not," he held her gaze. Then I try again." She laughed under her breath. "You're stubborn. So are you." They let that sit between them like a shared blanket. The moon climbed. The fire burned down to a steady glow. Arenya's eyelids felt heavy and sore, the kind of tired that happens after adrenaline leaves and leaves you emptied out. She lay on her side, facing him, because it felt wrong to put her back to the only person between her and the dark. "Tell me something true," she said quietly. "Why?" "So I can sleep," he considered. "I hate the sound of chains," he said. She nodded. "Me too. Your turn." "I like the way dough feels," she said. "When you knock it back and it pushes up to meet you, like it wants to become what it's meant to be." His mouth did that almost smile again. "That's very you." "What does that mean?" "You keep trying," he said. "Even after they used your kindness as a target." She stared at him a long time. "I don't know what to do with a compliment from a vampire." "Say thank you. Then prove me right." She smiled without meaning to. "Thank you." He leaned back against the willow trunk. "Sleep. I'll take first watch." "You'll take all the watch if I let you," she murmured. "Probably." She slept. It wasn't the heavy drop into nothingness it had been in the chapel. It was a drifting kind, full of shallow dreams, and the sound of water that wasn't there. She saw lights reflected in a river, lanterns swaying, a boat rocking. A face she almost recognized bending over her with a look that felt like coming home and saying, "You stubborn thing, breathe." A twig snapped somewhere beyond the willow. Arenya's eyes flew open. Cassian was already up, a hand held toward her, palm down, the silent command for stillness. She followed it without question. Voices moved through the dark, low, cautious. Wolf Scouts. Not many. 2, maybe 3. The pack hadn't given up. Of course they hadn't. Pride doesn't sleep when it thinks it's been mocked. Cassian's head tilted. He pointed to the left, then touched his chest and shook his head. "Not me. You. Go. The path." He'd draw them off. She shook her head immediately. Leaving him felt wrong in a way that had no logic and too much weight. He gave her a look that said, "We will argue about this later if you insist on living." The scouts moved closer. She smelled old leather and dogwood smoke. One of them muttered about how the reeds showed signs of passage. The other said the Alpha Second would tan their hides if they came back empty. Cassian signed again. "Go." She slid backward into the grass, slipping between shadows, keeping low the way he'd taught her without teaching. She'd nearly reached the tree line when a loose stone skittered under her boot. A head snapped up. "There!" they charged. She ran, heart punching at her ribs. Branches whipped her arms. The path dipped. She vaulted a fallen trunk, landed wrong, turned the stumble into a roll by luck and necessity. Footsteps thundered behind her. They never caught her. Not because she was faster, though fear makes anyone fast, but because Cassian stepped into their path like the night had decided to take a shape and argue. The first scout swung a short blade. Cassian didn't bother drawing steel. He moved inside the arc and took the man's wrist, turning the momentum into dirt and pain without breaking bone. The second scout lunged with a spear. Cassian caught the haft, slid his grip, and used the scout's own weight to plant him belly first in the moss. Breath woofed out. The third stopped short, suddenly aware this was not a fair fight in the way people pretend fairness matters. "Go home," Cassian said, voice low and close to a growl. "Tell your Alpha he threw a woman into a river, and the river sent her back with a friend. If he wants her, he can come himself." The terrified one made the sign against evil with his fingers. "You don't get to call a vampire friend." He spat, bravado curdled with fear. "I get to call myself whatever I like," Cassian said. "Tonight I'm the reason you don't limp for a month." "Leave." They left, dragging the one who'd lost his breath, supporting the one who'd lost his sense. Cassian didn't chase them. He watched until the sounds faded, then turned to where Arenya huddled among ferns, adrenaline shaking her bones. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head, and then laughed, because sometimes the body packs too many answers at once. "You could have killed them." "I could have," he agreed. "You didn't. Not tonight." "Why?" "Because I don't like the kind of stories that begin with me tearing someone's son apart in front of someone else's son. And because they were doing their job poorly. Not cruelty well." He paused. Your alpha is the kind that makes other people cruel so he doesn't have to get his hands dirty. Her stomach turned. Yes, she said. Then he's the one who gets my teeth if it comes to it. The words settled on her skin like armor. They returned to the willow. The fire had settled to coals. Cassian replaced the branch that had snapped, and sat closer this time, not touching but near enough that the space between them felt chosen. Thank you, she said, and heard how many things lived inside those two words, for the warning, for the restraint, for standing like a wall when her legs weren't enough. Sleep, he said again, softer than before. We'll move before dawn. She didn't argue. When she lay down, he reached to pull the cloak better over her shoulder. His fingers brushed the side of her neck, where the seer had once marked her with ash. A breath caught in both their throats at the same time. He froze. She didn't. She leaned, just a little, into the touch that wasn't a touch anymore. Arenya, he said, a warning to himself. I know, she whispered. Me too. He drew back slowly, as if every inch cost him. The fire ticked. The willow leaves whispered. The feeling didn't leave with his hand. It sat there between them, steady and bright, not loud, not rushing. Simply certain. She slept deeper this time. When dreams came, they brought no panic. Just water shining under lantern light, and a low voice making a promise it meant to keep. Not with flowers or oaths, but with a simple act of showing up again and again, whenever the world tried to turn mean. Cassian didn't sleep. He watched the dark and listened to the forest, and to the quieter sounds closer at hand. The way her breathing evened, the little catch when she turned, the soft sigh that escaped when her body found a place that didn't hurt. He did not try to explain the pull in his chest, he only respected it. Sometime near the hour when the birds think about singing, he let his eyes close. He didn't drift. He fell into the place where memory and something older braided. He was back on a different bank, under a different tree, with smoke on the wind and a battle behind him, and water in front. A woman stood at the edge with her hands bound, staring him down like she knew what he would do. Her mouth formed his name, and it wasn't the one he used now. He stepped forward. He always did. He woke with his hand half extended, fingers closing on air. A grey line had broken open the east. Birds whispered decisions to each other in the canopy. Arenya was already awake, propped on an elbow, watching him with eyes that had traded their fear for something fiercer. Morning, she said. Almost, he said. They put out the coals and shouldered what little they had. As they turned toward the path, she touched his sleeve. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. You asked me yesterday what I wanted, she said. I didn't know how to answer. I think I do now. All right. I want to stop running from who I am. He nodded slowly. We can do that. We, he said, like it was the obvious way to say it. They started east, the willow at their backs, the road ahead drawing a thin line through trees that glowed with first light. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The silence they shared now wasn't the kind that holds its breath to survive. It was the kind that lets you hear your own footsteps next to someone else's and know, without proof yet, that the path you're on might finally be the right one. By the second day, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks silvered by the sun, and the air lost that thick, swampy chill of the riverlands. The ground turned soft underfoot, scattered with pine needles. Arenya walked beside Cassian, her hair half dry, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She hadn't planned on surviving this long, not after the bridge, not after the river's cold hands. Survival did strange things to people. It made you notice the small miracles again, the way the morning fog clung to Cassian's cloak, the sound of his boots in the mud beside hers, the way his voice dropped, low and calm, whenever he said her name. He still didn't speak much, but when he did, it was never wasted. He asked questions no one else ever had, not, what happened to you, but, what did you love most before all of this? She thought about it for a while. The smell of bread baking, she said finally. And the quiet, just before dawn. When the world's still deciding who it's going to be that day. He nodded, like he understood exactly. And you? She asked. He hesitated, eyes on the horizon. The first moment before night. When the light fades but the stars aren't out yet. It feels honest. Like the world's showing its cracks. Arenya smiled softly. That's a strange thing to love. It's the only time I ever felt human, Cassian said. That word hung there between them. Human. Arenya didn't know what to say, so she just kept walking. But something shifted in her. The man who'd pulled her from the river wasn't a monster. He was a wound that refused to heal, walking around in the shape of a man. By midday they reached an old bridge half swallowed by ivy. It looked abandoned, like everything else in this forgotten part of the kingdom. Cassian stopped, scanning the horizon. Rest here, he said. We'll cross at dusk. She didn't argue. Her feet ached, and her stomach had been empty since morning. Cassian dropped his pack and handed her a small loaf wrapped in cloth. Stale, but food. She broke it in half and gave him the other piece. You don't eat this, she said. He shrugged. Old habits die hard. Arenya tilted her head. Do you miss it? Food? No. Being like us. Cassian's jaw worked, like he was turning the words over before releasing them. Sometimes. But most days. I think I just miss not remembering everything. She frowned. What do you mean? He looked past her, at the river below the bridge. Humans forget pain. Time dulls it. For us, it doesn't fade. It just waits. You can bury it under centuries, but it's still there. Every choice. Every loss. Every face you couldn't save. Arenya's throat tightened. That's why you save people. Cassian turned toward her. His expression softened. Maybe, or maybe, I'm just trying to balance the scales before I run out of time. Do you think there's ever enough saving to balance it? I don't know. He looked at her then, truly looked, like she was an answer to a question he'd been carrying far too long. But when I pulled you from that river, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was trying to make up for anything. It just felt right. Arenya's pulse skipped. Cassian. She whispered, unsure what to do with the weight in her chest. He smiled, barely. You don't need to say anything. I'm not asking for thanks. That's not what I... She stopped herself, because even she didn't know what she meant. She just knew that every time she looked at him, she felt less like the cursed girl the pack had tried to drown, and more like someone who could still matter. They stayed near the bridge until the sun began to fall. Cassian found an abandoned watchtower nearby, its stones crumbling but dry. He gathered brush for a small fire, while Arenya tended to the cuts on her hands. When he finished, he pulled a small pouch from his coat, and poured something dark into a cup. She recognized the scent, blood mixed with herbs. He caught her glance. Old mix, he said simply, takes the edge off. She didn't flinch. Do you ever get tired of hiding what you are? Cassian's mouth quirked. Do you? She smiled a little. Touché. He handed her his water skin. Drink. You'll need it for the climb tomorrow. She took it, their fingers brushing. The contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. She pulled her hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. He had. But he didn't mention it. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable now. The flames painted soft light over his face, picking out the faint scar across his mouth, the tired lines under his eyes. He looked less like a legend and more like a man who'd been walking too long. You said once that dreams aren't kind to you, she said quietly. Why? He poked at the fire with a stick. Because they don't lie. They show me what I lost, and remind me that I can't have it back. Arenya's heart ached for him. She wanted to ask who or what he'd lost, but before she could, his eyes flicked to hers, and the question died on her tongue. Do you believe people can change? He asked suddenly. Sometimes. And wolves? They're people too, she said, smiling faintly. He shook his head. Not the ones who threw you into the river. Arenya's smile faded. No, they don't change. They only hide it better. Then let them drown in what they built, Cassian said, his voice firm. You don't owe them forgiveness. Her breath caught. I never said I did. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on her. Then stop carrying them. Every step you take, thinking about what they did, is another step they steal from you. Her throat tightened again, but she nodded. I'm trying. I know. His tone softened. That's what matters. The fire crackled between them. The night was quiet except for the hum of insects and the faint rush of the river below. Arenya studied him. The way the firelight touched his cheekbones, the way his voice wrapped around her name when he spoke it. There was something magnetic about him, something she couldn't explain. "Cassian," she said, "if you could go back, before the exile, before the coven, would you?" He shook his head. "No, I'd still end up here." "How can you be so sure?" He gave her a small smile. "Because fate's patient. It waits for us to stop running." Her chest ached again, the kind of ache that wasn't pain. It was recognition. She turned her gaze toward the river, where moonlight shimmered over the surface like broken glass. "When you pulled me from the water," she said, "I thought I was dead. I remember thinking, if I died there, maybe it would finally stop. The fear. The loneliness." Cassian said nothing. "But then I saw your face," she continued softly, "and I realized I didn't want to die anymore." Cassian's hand flexed against his knee. For a long time he didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached out, not quite touching her but close enough that the warmth of his palm brushed the edge of her sleeve. "You don't owe me your life," he said. "You just have to live it." "I don't know how," she whispered. "Then I'll show you." Arenya's breath caught. She turned toward him, and the distance between them disappeared like mist in sunlight. He didn't kiss her, not yet. But he looked at her in a way no one ever had. Not like she was broken, not like she was cursed, but like she was seen. It was enough to make her heart forget how to guard itself. They didn't sleep much that night. Cassian kept the fire low, his senses tuned to every sound outside the tower. Arenya drifted in and out of half-dreams. Flashes of her mother's face, of wolves, eyes glinting in torchlight, of water closing over her again. When she woke just before dawn, Cassian was gone. Panic shot through her chest, but before she could stand, she saw him emerge from the shadows carrying something in his hand, a cluster of wildflowers, small, white, and bruised by frost. "For the road," he said, setting them near her pack. "They grow near the stream. Thought you'd like them." Her voice caught. "Why?" he shrugged. "You kept me company last night. Thought I'd return the favor." Arenya smiled, tracing a finger over the petals. "You're a strange vampire, Cassian Crowe. I've been called worse." She laughed. Soft, real, the kind of laugh that healed more than it hurt. They broke camp and continued east. The woods opened slowly, and by afternoon, the trees thinned enough to reveal the edge of the valley. In the distance, the faint outline of the old border road shimmered under the heat. "That's the way," Cassian said. Arenya nodded, but the idea of parting suddenly felt heavier than it should. "When we reach the town," she said carefully, "what happens then?" "You decide where to go next." "And you?" "I don't stay anywhere long." Her chest tightened. "So that's it, you save me and disappear." He glanced at her, and for a moment, the mask slipped. She saw something raw flicker behind his calm, something that looked a lot like longing. "I don't want to disappear," he said quietly, "but I'm not good at staying." Arenya stepped closer, heart pounding. "Maybe you just haven't had a reason to." He looked at her then, really looked, and the rest of the world seemed to vanish. No river, no pack, no coven. Just two souls who didn't realize they'd been circling each other for centuries. "I think," he said slowly, "you might be that reason." And before she could speak, before doubt could rise, Cassian bent and pressed his forehead against hers. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it felt like a promise whispered across time. Her breath trembled. "Why does this feel familiar?" she whispered. He closed his eyes. "Because it is." The wind shifted through the valley, carrying the scent of rain and something older. Memory, maybe, or fate catching up to them at last. When they finally pulled apart, Arenya's eyes were bright with questions, but Cassian only smiled faintly. "Come on," he said. "We've still got a road to walk." She fell into step beside him, and though neither spoke, their hands brushed once, twice, until his fingers laced with hers, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Neither of them noticed the faint shimmer that followed their steps, a light only the oldest gods could see. The first flicker of recognition between souls that had found each other again after lifetimes apart. The border town looked like a place that had decided to keep its head down and mind its bread. Low stone buildings pressed close to the road. Stalls lined the square. Salted fish, rough-woven cloth, jars of pickles sealed with wax. A weathered chapel anchored the far corner, its bell tower leaning, as if exhaustion were a posture. Arenya and Cassian slipped into town at dusk with their hoods low and their pace unremarkable. He clocked every alley and rooftop without seeming to look. She took in the smell of yeast and wood smoke, and the way children chased each other between barrels, free in the way only children and fools manage. "Keep to the edge," Cassian murmured. "If your pack has runners here, I'd rather let them see shadows than faces." She nodded. The ache in her wrists had faded to a memory, but the old fear, of being recognized, of being named, still flared when boots clacked too close. They found the tavern that looked least curious. The barmaid had sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smile that didn't promise anything but fair change. Cassian slid coin across the counter. "A corner room. 2 nights. No visitors. No questions," the barmaid said, which was the same promise in different clothes. "You want supper? Bread, stew and tea," Arenya said before Cassian could answer. He glanced at her, the hint of a smile, softening the sharp lines around his mouth. Upstairs, the room was narrow but clean. A single bed, a stool by the shuttered window. The wall shared with the chapel made the air smell faintly of old incense. "I'll take the floor," Cassian said, already folding his cloak. "You'll take the bed," she countered. "I don't feel like arguing with a man who hauled me out of a river." "Then don't," he said mildly, which was infuriating and endearing in equal measure. They ate at the small table. The stew was thin and honest. The bread was better than it looked. When she broke it, steam rose like a blessing. She brushed the top with the heel of her hand, a habit, and realized only after that she'd been imagining the shine of milk on a scored leaf. "After this," Cassian said, "we go east of the quarries. There's a quiet road out of sight from the main trade path. It'll buy time." "And then?" she asked, though she already knew the shape of his plan. By the way, he always described the next 2 moves and left anything beyond that unwritten. "Then you choose," he said. "North to the coast, south into the hills, west is closed. And you?" He didn't answer right away. He looked toward the shutter. "There's a place I go sometimes when I need to listen," he said finally. "An old crossing. Of a river. Of everything," he said, which should have sounded like nonsense and didn't. Cassian's hand came up beside hers, one finger resting in the curve where the 2 circles met. The bell didn't ring. Nothing dramatic happened. The town moved around them the way towns do when strangers put hands on old stones, without caring. But something in them changed. Arenya closed her eyes because keeping them open felt like trying to read, while a storm took apart the room. Her mind filled, fast and sure, with a place that wasn't this place, and a night that wasn't this night. The smell of smoke, not from a tavern but from torches, from fear. The bite of rope. The taste of river water lifted by oars. The bell of a different chapel tolling time they didn't have. She saw her hands bound in front of her instead of behind. She saw a man with black hair, and a scar at his mouth, and a soldier's coat, cut to flatter a body that didn't need flattery. She saw him moving through a crowd with the inevitability of a tide, not entitled, not pleading, decided, always decided. She saw herself lift her chin and dare him with her eyes to make the next choice the one she was hoping for. And then, water. Always water. Her breath stuttered. She opened her eyes. Cassian was already staring at her with the expression people wear when the past slides into place with a click loud enough for the bones to hear. "You remember," he said, not a question. "I remember," she whispered. "Then we tell it," he said, very calm. "All of it. And when we're done, we decide what we want now." She nodded. They stepped back from the stone, still touching each other with the thin wire of attention that had stretched between them since the river, and the town fell away. The first time they met, the city was called Vera, and the king loved himself more than his people. Arenya wasn't Arenya then. She was a healer's apprentice in the southern ward, human, poor, brave the way you get when you have no other choice. The coven owned the nights. The crown owned the days. Someone like her belonged to neither and both, used when convenient, ignored when not. He wasn't Cassian Crowe then, not to the world. He was Sir Cassian of the Night Court, a knight of the coven in everything but name, eyes winter cold and hands steady. The crest he wore was the same, 3 crows over a broken sun. He took orders from a magistrate who believed mercy was bad math. Their threads crossed on a market morning that should have been ordinary. The tithe collectors had come to Vera, ledger in hand, guard at heel. They read out arrears in the square, and dragged a woman to the steps because someone needed to be proof. Arenya stood at the edge of the crowd with a basket of herbs, measuring her courage against her caution. Courage won. "She has 2 children," she said, stepping forward. The crowd hushed the way it does when someone insists on being seen. "You want coin? Let her work the market, she'll pay in a month." The magistrate laughed the way men laugh when their decisions are costumes they're proud of. Sir Cassian did not laugh. He looked at the woman's hands. Work. Rough. Raw. He looked at the children with their lips pressed flat to imitate bravery. He looked at Arenya like he'd been waiting without knowing it. "Give her a month," he said to the magistrate, voice level. "There's no honor in pursuing hunger." "There's no honor in my ledger being wrong," the magistrate snapped. "Then write it right in a month," Cassian said, and everyone heard it. The smallest rebellion, almost nothing, and the first true thing. He paid the woman's tithe from his own purse. He paid with an ease that made the magistrate want to punish someone else later. Arenya watched the coin change hands and felt her opinion about monsters rearrange itself just enough to admit complexity. He followed her into the alley after, not because he meant to threaten, but because he wanted to look at the courage that had spoken, and make sure it didn't pay too high a price on the walk home. "You shouldn't stand where fire catches," he said. "And you shouldn't be the wind that fans it," she said back. She expected him to smile at that at least. He didn't. He looked at her like a man who had stopped expecting to be forgiven by anyone for anything. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. But later that week, when patrols cornered a child thief and made a game of whether to break fingers or pride first, he moved between cruelty and its target without drawing his sword, and afterward she found him where the alleys met and said, "Thank you," in a tone that acknowledged the risk. "You're the girl from the square," he said. "You're the knight who pays in coin and blood both," she said. "I try to pay in coin when I can," he said. "Blood follows anyway." She took to bringing him bread when she could spare the flour. He took to walking the long way round so his routes crossed her corner at dusk. In a city where everything had a price, they traded things that didn't. A warning here, a bundle of feverfew there, a look that said, "I see the good and the bad and I'm not going anywhere yet." The king's hunger grew the way hunger does when fed by fear. He announced a new law dressed like a blessing. Peace by offering. 1 wolf from each den, 1 human from each ward, 1 witch, if they could find one, bound and presented at the old bridge on the last night of summer, as a sign that all houses bent the knee together. The coven swore to keep the peace. The crown swore to keep the coven in check. The people swore, mostly because oaths in a frightened mouth sound like prayer. Arenya went to the old bridge because she could not bear the idea of not bearing witness. Cassian went because he had orders. The magistrate wanted compliance. The king wanted spectacle. The coven wanted obedience. None of them wanted a whisper at the wrong time. The crowd gathered. Torches painted the river copper. The bell at the chapel beyond swung heavy in the tower. The chosen stood with ropes at their wrists, eyes hard, shoulders square, the math of sacrifice written in their bones. The king spoke of unity. The priest spoke of cleansing. The magistrate spoke of law. Arenya moved before the rope touched the first wrist. "No," she said. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a refusal wrapped in the voice of someone who had nothing to trade but herself. Cassian stepped when she did, because some decisions only ever come in pairs. The magistrate's hand twitched toward his signal. Cassian didn't wait for it. He cut the rope instead, fast, clean, and the crowd sucked in air like a single lung. "We can't build a peace out of bodies," he said, speaking to the king and the priest, and the man who used to own his loyalty. "I won't be part of it." He meant to die for that line. He was prepared for it. He had the shape of it in his body, the angle of the blade, the shock in the wrist when steel meets steel, but the king was not the kind who killed with his own hands. He gestured to soldiers and to certain wolves whose allegiance had been bought in meat and promises. In the confusion, in the surge, someone pushed Arenya, and her foot slipped on torch-greased stone. The rail was low. The river waited beneath, always ready to make quiet what the world made loud. She fell. The water hit like a wall. Cassian threw himself over the rail, without looking for permission from anything so small as a law. He found her by the bright, terrified burn of her and dragged her up. For a moment they were alone in a world bordered only by breath and the thud of hearts. "Breathe," he said, and he smiled, the scar at his mouth softening, like he'd been born to say that word to her and had finally been given the chance. They made it to the far bank under the chapel's shadow, while the crowd tore itself trying to decide whether to watch a rescue or a rebellion. He lifted her onto the stones and looked like a man who had found the one thing he'd been looking for without knowing it. "What have you done?" she asked, because sometimes love starts with better questions than declarations. He laughed once, surprised at himself. Something right for once. They ran. The city tried to hold them with alleys and whispers, and men who thought duty was a reason to ignore conscience. They made it to the chapel and it's quiet. He barred the door with a bench. She caught her breath sitting on the steps, water in her hair, rope burns on her wrists, and courage still hot enough to scold. "They'll come," she said. "I know," he said. "They'll kill you. Probably, and me." "No," he said. "Not while I'm alive." She almost smiled. "That isn't comforting." "It wasn't meant to be," he said, and for the first time she saw the shape of the vow forming between them. Inelegant, absolute, the kind that doesn't ask for blessing because it already is one for the two people inside it. They could have run again. They didn't. They walked to the altar with wet boots, and a truth that didn't care who heard it. 2 circles were carved into the lintel over the door, interlocked. The old priest who kept the chapel's keys had fled when the bell tolled. There was no one left to witness what they did but the gods and themselves. "Name," he said, because oaths need them. She gave it. He gave his. He pricked his palm with his blade, and she did the same with her needle. They pressed hands, and made a vow that had no poetry, and therefore more power than most poems. "I will find you in whatever time they leave us," he said. "And I will learn to live long enough to meet you there," she said. The soldiers broke the door. The magistrate shouted. The king stayed away, as he always did, letting other people be brave on his behalf. Wolves came through the window like shadows with teeth. Cassian didn't try to fight the army. He fought the first 2 through the door, then the third, then put his back to the altar and made a wall out of himself. He took a blade meant for her and laughed at the pain, like a man who had eaten worse for breakfast. When the river called again, because the river always calls, he threw the bench aside and lifted her, not to carry her to safety this time but to put her feet on the floor where the vow had landed, so if he fell, something holy would catch the noise of it. A wolf, a young one with fear making him older than he was, lunged. Cassian moved to take the blow, and saw at the last second that the angle would put the wolf's momentum into the woman he had just promised to follow across time. He changed his body's mind mid-flight, and took the wound in his own ribs. He staggered. He stayed. He smiled down at her like, "Yes, this hurts, and yes, I would do it again." They dragged him to the rail at the old bridge, and asked him to take back the words he had said with his mouth and his body. He looked at Arenya where they held her and shook his head. "No," he said, so gently it cut. "No." The magistrate made a speech about order. A wolf jeered because it's easier to hate what you fear than to admit you want its courage. They threw him into the river bound at the wrists, and Arenya screamed without breath, the kind of sound you only make once. He went under. He didn't come back up. The crowd dispersed with the quickness of people who have seen something true and need to pretend they didn't. Arenya didn't die. That was her part of the vow. She lived, first out of spite, then out of habit. Then because she learned that living makes room for the next right thing. That winter she carved 2 circles over a different door in a different town, a mark to remind herself that promises wait. When she finally died, old and stubborn and still telling anyone who would listen that mercy was better math, she died with her hand closed around a riverstone she'd carried all her life, because it had the weight of a word in it. He didn't die, not permanently. That was his part of the vow. Vampires are difficult guests at death's table. He woke on a muddy bank with water in his lungs and cold in his bones, and a certainty that he had left something unfinished with someone whose voice he could hear in the spaces between heartbeats. He went on to do what men like him do when they have lost the thing that showed them they were more than their orders. He made new orders and followed them, and all of them had the same first line: "Save who you can." He wore his exile like a uniform, and waited without calling it waiting. The memory ended the way memories do when they have finally hit the place where they were always headed. In silence, not empty, full. Arenya's palm was still on the lintel. Cassian's finger still traced the seam where the circles met. She let her hand fall. The square looked like a square again. The chapel looked like a building. But the air between them had learned their names, and it said them back. Arenya. Cassian. Not for the first time. Not for the last. Now you know, he said, his voice not quite steady. I knew before I knew, she said, and smiled, even with tears slicking her lashes. I think I always do things that way, he laughed, soft and broken. It made people at the well look over, because a sound that honest startles more than a shout. He didn't care. Neither did she. The moment should have been theirs. The past had just returned like a debt paid with interest. But the world rarely lets lovers have unbroken minutes, especially when the world has put effort into making them don't. The first hint that the quiet was over came as a smell. Smoke and dogwood, and the bitter tang of a man who eats victory like a spice. Then came the line of riders at the edge of the square, not bothering to hide their purpose, because cruelty dressed as law never thinks it has to be subtle. The alpha came himself. He sat his horse like a man who thinks height is the same as right. His second, fennel-breathed mouth hard, flanked him. The pack fanned out around the square, blocking lanes, filling doorways, turning a town built for bread into a trap. Thorne, the alpha called, not bothering with Arenya's given name, because names grant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement whispers of equality. You found your way to market. That will make the work simpler. Cassian stepped half a pace so that anyone looking head-on had to look at him to see her. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to for everyone to understand he was one. Your work tonight, he said, is leaving. The alpha smiled the way men do when they're used to their smiles finishing what their hands start. You're far from your court, Blood King. I don't have a court, Cassian said. I have a promise. The alpha glanced at the circles carved over the chapel door, and some small thing in his face tightened. Men who rule by dominance recognize symbols that don't bow to it. She belongs to the pack, he said. She broke law. She broke your pride. Cassian corrected mildly. The laws of men are smaller than the laws of mercy. This town isn't yours. And she wasn't yours even when you lived under the same roofs. Murmurs went through the circle of watchers. The barmaid from the tavern wiped her hands on her apron and didn't move, which was its own kind of moving. Arenya stepped up beside Cassian, shoulder to shoulder. She had been running since the river. She was done. If it's law you want, she called to the alpha, hear mine. I owe you nothing. Not my hands, not my voice, not my body, not my breath. Your breath is a curse. The second spat. Your song weakens leaders. Arenya's chin lifted. She looked past the alpha to the boys at the back. Not yet hard, not yet convinced that their only choices were cruelty or obedience. Only the kind of leader who's afraid of listening, she said. Only the kind of leader who thinks power means never having to soften. Cassian's hand brushed hers where the townsfolk couldn't see. Not a signal. A presence. The alpha swung down from his horse. The square pulled in, and then pulled back like breath. He walked forward with his shoulders loose, a predator showing confidence. Enough, you're coming with us, he said to Arenya, as if the decision had already been made and not by her. If you make me work for it, I'll make you regret that too. Cassian put himself the rest of the way in front of her. If you take one more step, I will put you on your knees, he said quietly. I don't want to. It won't be good for these boys to learn the lesson that way. But I will. Something old moved behind the alpha's eyes. The knowledge that the person in front of him was not making a threat. He was making a schedule. Pride makes cowards rash. He lunged. Cassian shifted. No flourish, no waste. And the alpha hit the square with his face and his arrogance at the same time. Pain makes clarity. He scrambled, humiliated, and went for his knife. Cassian's boot came down on the wrist and held. Not enough to break. Enough to demonstrate that mercy is a choice, not a lack of ability. Look at your men, Cassian said, his voice for the alpha alone. Look at their faces. What lesson do you want them to learn about strength right now? The alpha's breath came hard through his nose. He looked. He saw mirrors where he expected adoration. He saw fear, yes, but not the kind that binds loyalty. The kind that breeds escape plans. Arenya stepped forward. "Hear me," she said, not in a shout and not in a song. Just in her voice, which had always been the truest thing she owned. "I could break you. That's the truth. I could sing and make your knees find the ground, and your hands find your throat, because dominance is flimsy. When someone reminds your body it's not a god." A sound went through the square like wind through wheat. She kept going, even though her wrists remembered rope, and her lungs remembered water. "But I won't," she said. "Because I'm done living by your rules, and your favorite rule is that pain is proof. Here's mine. Mercy is power too." Cassian lifted his boot. The alpha didn't move for a heartbeat, because moving would have meant admitting he took the permission. Then he rolled to his knees and pushed to his feet, not meeting anyone's eyes. "You're making a mistake," he told Arenya. "Trying to claim the last word, because men like him always need to believe in last words. You'll find the world hungrier than you expect." Arenya smiled, small and terrifying. "I know how to bake," she said. Laughter broke the tension like a good knife through bad rope. The alpha flinched as if hit. He gathered what he could of his authority and his men, and left the square with as much dignity as a man can fake when dignity has just been pulled like a rug. The townsfolk didn't clap. This wasn't a play. But the barmaid nodded once to Arenya, as she would to anyone who had done something difficult in public. It felt like a coronation. Cassian turned, the adrenaline fading out of him in a visible wave. Arenya met his eyes, and felt the click of recognition again, less like thunder now, more like a lock opened with the right key. "You didn't sing," he said softly. "I didn't need to," she said. "I had another voice tonight." "Whose?" "Mine," she said, and then, gentler, "and yours." They stood under the two interlocked circles and let the world go on around them, the bargaining, the sweeping, the lighting of evening lamps. He reached for her hand, because he had in another life, and because he wanted to in this one. She took it because vows work best when they're made twice. "What do you want now?" he asked, the question that matters after memory returns. She looked at the road east and the hills south, and the sky that would keep changing its mind about weather. She looked at the chapel that had held their first promise, and at the town that had just risked a breath with them. Then she looked at him, the man who had ruined his obedience for her once and his anonymity for her again. "I want a place where no one gets to define me by their fear," she said. "I want to work and sing if I want, and bake bread that shines for people who've forgotten they deserve good things. I want to stop running." He nodded like he'd guessed but needed to hear it. "Then we make a home," he said. "We?" she asked, because teasing is a kind of love when you already know the answer. "We," he said. "I'm very bad at leaving you on bridges." She laughed, the sound pulling tears free in the most painless way. "You're very good at pulling me off them." They walked back to the tavern, not as fugitives, but as people who had a next thing to do. In the room, with the chapel at their shoulder and the road at their feet, he unrolled his cloak on the floor again, and she didn't argue, not because she had given up, but because she had decided their first bed in this life would be chosen together. "Tomorrow," he said, "we find a house with a hearth and a garden stubborn enough to grow thyme in bad soil, and a door with room for a carving," she said, eyes on his. "2 circles," he said. "Always," she replied, and kissed him, gentle first, then certain, the way people do who have had centuries to work up to it. When they parted, the chapel bell finally rang for vespers. The sound poured through the shutters and across their hands linked on the table. Outside, the town settled into its evening hum. Somewhere, downriver, water kept doing what water does, moving, remembering, forgiving. They stood at the window and watched the square hold dusk like a bowl. He looked at her face, as if learning it for the first time, and the 100th. "If they come again," he said, "we'll meet them together." "If the past comes again," she said, "we'll meet that together too." "It will," he said. "It always does." "Then so will we," she said, and leaned her shoulder against his. For a while they said nothing, because love sometimes sounds best when it borrows silence. When sleep came, it came like a friend who knows the way without knocking. In the morning, they would ask for names of empty cottages, and buy flour, and argue amiably about where to plant the thyme. In the weeks after, the pack would find a different bridge to gather on and decide, in a series of small, unpublic ways, to be led by someone who didn't flinch at listening. The coven would hear rumors that the rogue in black had traded the road for a hearth, and misread that as weakness. The town would learn that a woman with steady hands could keep a fever from taking a child, and that a quiet man could make a drunk think twice without raising his voice. And over the new door, where the light hit just right at dawn, 2 circles would be carved, perfectly ordinary, perfectly true. If you've ever been told your voice is too soft, your hope too naive, your love too much, tell me this. When did you learn that mercy was its own kind of strength? And who would you be if you believed it, every day, the way they finally did?